April 29, 1945. A field outside Pilsen, Czechoslovakia. The sound of cattle lowing in the distance. They had been marching for 6 days without food. Not a crust of bread. Not a sip of soup. Nothing but the dust of collapsing empires on their tongues. And now, as they stumbled into a makeshift American camp, these German women in Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms, their eyes hollow, their lips cracked, they were about to encounter something that would shatter every assumption. The Reich had fed them about their enemy. What they found waiting wasn't interrogation rooms or firing squads. It was something far more devastating to their understanding of the world. A table set for dinner. The spring of 1945 was the season of reckoning. Across Europe, the machinery of the Third Reich wasn't just breaking down, it was disintegrating in real time, scattering millions of displaced souls across a landscape of rubble and ash. Among them were approximately 40,000 German women who had served in various capacities within the Wehrmacht system Nachrichtenfeldern, communication specialists, Stabshelferinnen, administrative assistants, Flugmeldhelferinnen, aircraft spotters. They weren't technically soldiers. The Nazi ideology, which had spent 12 years insisting that a woman's place was in the home, bearing children for the fatherland, had quietly abandoned that fiction when manpower ran short. By 1944, women were operating radar stations, decoding messages, manning anti-aircraft searchlights, and coordinating logistics for armies that were bleeding out on every front. These women had been told they were essential, vital, guardians of civilization against the Bolshevik hordes and the decadent, mongrelized West. They had been assured that Germany's cause was righteous, that its soldiers were the finest in the world, that its enemies were subhuman. And now, as the Reich collapsed around them, they found themselves on the wrong side of history, retreating westward in terror of Soviet retribution, hoping against hope that surrender to the Americans or British might mean survival. The group that arrived outside Pilsen in late April had been part of a communications unit attached to Army Group Center. When the order came to evacuate, they had packed what little they could carry and joined the chaotic flood of refugees, deserters, and remnant military units streaming away from the advancing Red Army. Their commanding officer, a middle-aged Oberleutnant who still believed in doing things properly, had maintained a forced semblance of discipline for the first 2 days. Then he disappeared one night, simply vanished into the darkness, leaving them leaderless. The Wehrmacht supply system, which had been functioning on fumes and plunder for months, evaporated entirely. The bread rations stopped. The field kitchens never appeared. The promised rendezvous points turned out to be empty crossroads or burning villages. By the 3rd day, they were eating grass and dandelions. By the 4th, some were too weak to walk and had to be carried by their companions. By the 5th, they had stopped talking about food because it hurt too much. One of them, a 22-year-old from Dresden named Marguerite, would later write in her diary, "I understood then what my grandmother meant when she spoke of the hunger winter of 1917. Your body doesn't just ache, it begins to consume itself. You can feel it. And your mind plays tricks. I saw entire feasts in the clouds. Roasted geese, apple strudel, fresh cream. I wept over visions." On the 6th day, American forward scouts from the 2nd Cavalry Group encountered them on a rural road south of Pilsen. The women were in terrible shape, some barely conscious, others delirious, all of them filthy and skeletal. The young GI who first spotted them, a farm boy from Montana named Corporal James Riley, would later recall, "I thought they were concentration camp survivors at first. That's how bad they looked. Then I saw the uniforms, what was left of them anyway, and realized they were German military. But they weren't fighting. Hell, they could barely stand." The standing orders were clear: disarm enemy personnel, separate them by rank, establish identity, and send them back to the prisoner collection points for processing. But Corporal Riley and his squad were cavalry scouts horsemen, in the old tradition that the Army still maintained in certain units. They were from ranching country, Montana, Wyoming, Nebraska, Texas, men who had grown up around cattle and understood the ethic of the range. You didn't let anything starve, not even your enemy's livestock. And these women, whatever they'd been 6 days ago, weren't enemies anymore. They were just broken people who needed help. Riley sent a runner back to the squadron headquarters. Within an hour, Captain Robert Dutch Hendricks arrived with a small convoy. Hendricks was a 34-year-old cattleman from Abilene, Texas, who'd been riding horses since before he could walk properly. He'd joined the cavalry in 1940 when it still had actual horses, had mourned when they'd been replaced by armored cars and jeeps, but had kept the cowboy spirit alive in his unit through sheer force of personality. His men called themselves the Range Riders, and they wore their Stetsons whenever regulations permitted, and sometimes when they didn't. Captain Hendricks took one look at the women and made a decision that would have court-martialed a more cautious officer. Get them to the field. Set up a chow line. And somebody find the chaplain, tell him we need every blessing he's got. What happened next was recorded in fragments, diary entries, official after-action reports, letters home, and post-war testimonies. The cavalrymen, most of whom hadn't seen their own families in 2 years, went into action with startling efficiency. They established a perimeter around an open field, not to guard the prisoners, but to give them space and privacy. They brought up water trucks first, not to drink immediately, which could kill someone in advanced starvation, but to wash, to clean wounds, to restore some measure of dignity. Several men rigged up canvas screens so the women could wash and change in private. Then came the food. And this is where the story transforms. From a tale of military logistics into something that approached the mythic. The 2nd Cavalry Group had just received a supply drop the previous day, one of those glorious moments when the quartermaster gods smiled and everything arrived at once. They had more rations than they knew what to do with. Canned meats, powdered milk, crackers, fruit cocktail, chocolate bars, coffee, sugar, condensed soup. The American war machine, whatever its flaws, had achieved something that still stuns historians. It had ensured that its soldiers ate better in the field than most civilians ate at home. A single key ration pack contained more calories and variety than the average German citizen had seen in a week by 1945. For these starving women, it would seem like something from another universe. But Captain Hendricks didn't just order the standard issue. He did something remarkable. He told his men to set tables, actual tables, constructed from wooden ammunition crates and planks scavenged from a nearby barn, covered with white parachute silk that had been salvaged from a downed supply drop, set with canteen cups instead of crystal, but set nonetheless, arranged with care, with intention, with the kind of ritualized hospitality that these cowboys had learned from their mothers and grandmothers back in ranch country, where you always set a proper table, even if you were serving beans and hardtack. The company cook, Sergeant Willie Malone, a black cavalryman from Oklahoma who could make canned Spam taste like Sunday dinner, worked what his buddies called prairie magic. He heated the rations, mixed in some of the powdered milk to make a thin gravy, warmed the fruit cocktail until it steamed in the cool evening air, and brewed coffee so strong it could wake the dead and convince them to re-enlist. As one private put it, it wasn't haute cuisine, but it was hot, it was plentiful, and it was served with something these women hadn't experienced in a very long time: respect. When the women were led to the field walking slowly, supported by medics and translators, they stopped. Simply stopped, as if they'd hit an invisible wall. Marguerite's diary again. I thought I was hallucinating. Tables. Set tables. In the middle of a field. In the middle of a war. with American soldiers standing beside them like waiters in some impossible restaurant at the end of the world. One of the older women, a former schoolteacher named Helga, who had volunteered for the Wehrmacht in 1943 after her sons were killed at Stalingrad, began to weep. Not quietly. She sobbed, great heaving cries that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her starved body should have been able to reach. A translator, a German-American private from Wisconsin, asked her what was wrong. Helga replied, "Sie haben einen Tisch gedeckt." They set a table. For us. For us. The propaganda they'd been fed for years had painted Americans as cowboys in the most savage sense, lawless brutes. Racially inferior, cultureless mongrels who would rape, pillage, and destroy without mercy. They'd been told that surrender to the Americans was only marginally better than capture by the Soviets. They'd been shown newsreels of bombing raids, of destroyed German cities, of American G is laughing amid the ruins. Every image had reinforced the same message. These are not civilized people. These are barbarians in uniform. And now these barbarians were pulling out chairs for them. The cavalry troopers, under Captain Hendrix's watchful eye, served the food themselves. They didn't delegate it to prisoners or local civilians. They did it personally. They ladled soup. They poured coffee. They opened ration tins of fruit cocktail and spooned them into canteen cups. They unwrapped chocolate bars, those famous Hershey's Tropical, bars that could survive any climate, and placed them beside each plate. And they did it with a strange, rough gentleness that these women had never associated with soldiers of any nation. Much less the enemy, Private First Class Raymond Hoskins. A ranch hand from Wyoming would later tell a reporter, "Hell, it wasn't about politics. It wasn't even about being nice, really. It was just, you don't let folks starve. My old man would have skinned me alive if I'd let women sit there hungry when we had food." Didn't matter which side they'd been on. War was over for them. That was plain enough. The women ate slowly at first, as the medics had instructed. Starvation is a peculiar cruelty. You can't simply gorge yourself back to health. You have to relearn eating, sip by sip, bite by bite. Some of them vomited. Some couldn't keep anything down at first. But the cavalrymen were patient. They brought more soup, more water, more coffee. They sat with the women, not hovering, not interrogating, just present, ensuring they weren't alone. The truth of what happened in that field remained buried in scattered records for decades, documented in personal letters and unit diaries, but never making it into the grand narratives of the war's final days. We've spent months tracking down these accounts, interviewing descendants, and piecing together testimony. If you want to see more untold stories like this, moments that reveal the complicated humanity beneath the clash of nations, subscribe and turn on notifications. As night fell, someone produced a harmonica. A soldier from Nebraska played "Home on the Range," that quintessentially American cowboy melody. A few of the Germans who had learned English in better times recognized the tune. One of them began to hum along. Then another. The sound was fragile, tentative, like the first birdsong after a bombardment. Marguerite wrote, "We were the enemy. We knew that. We had worked for the machines that had killed their friends, bombed their cities, tried to conquer the world in the name of a madman we had been too frightened or too foolish to resist. We deserved their hatred. We expected it. What we received instead was incomprehensible. Coffee, chocolate, a table set with care. Men who looked at us and saw human beings, not monsters. I broke then, in a way I hadn't broken through all the retreats, all the bombings, all the fear. I broke because of kindness." The psychological impact of this encounter rippled through the group in ways that would take years to fully process. These women had spent the final years of the war in a state of cognitive dissonance, serving a regime that told them they were essential while also treating them as inferior beings whose primary value was biological. They had seen the Reich's brutality firsthand, its contempt for weakness, its worship of strength and domination. They had internalized, consciously or not, the idea that might makes right, that the strong devour the weak, that mercy is weakness, and here were these Americans victors, conquerors. The strong choosing mercy. It shattered something fundamental. Not in a dramatic, instantaneous way, but slowly, like ice cracking under the warmth of an unexpected spring. One of the women, a former radio operator named Ing, told an interviewer in 1983, "I had believed we were the civilized ones, that we represented culture, order, discipline against chaos, that our enemies were beneath us. That field, that meal, that terrible kindness, it forced me to confront what we had been, what I had been a part of. Because if they could show humanity after everything we'd done, what did that make us for not having shown it first?" The next morning, the women were processed according to regulations and transferred to a proper POW facility. But before they left, Captain Hendricks gathered his men and addressed them. A private who was present recorded his words in a letter home. "The captain told us we'd done good, but that we shouldn't go getting sentimental about it. Said those women had been part of an evil system, and feeding them didn't change that. But he also said that we fight to end that evil, not to become it ourselves. Said we were Americans, and Americans don't starve people, even our enemies. Especially our enemies, because that's what makes us different. Made us worth fighting for." It was the cowboy ethic translated into wartime morality. You can defeat a man without destroying his dignity. You can win without becoming what you fought against. It was, in its own rough-hewn way, a philosophy as old as the open range, the understanding that cruelty breeds only cruelty. But that strength tempered with decency might actually change something fundamental. Of course, the story is more complicated than a simple morality play. Not all American units behaved this way. There were atrocities committed by Allied forces, 2 rapes, murders, summary executions. The war in Europe was brutal on all sides, and the discovery of the concentration camps had hardened many soldiers beyond any possibility of mercy toward Germans. The 2nd Cavalry Group's response was not universal. It was exceptional, which is precisely what makes it worth examining, and the German women themselves were not innocent victims. They had been part of the Wehrmacht apparatus, the military machine that had invaded Poland, France, the Soviet Union, and countless other nations. The communications they had processed, the logistics they had coordinated, the aircraft they had helped direct, all of it had contributed to a war of annihilation that killed tens of millions. Their starvation was tragic, but it was also a direct consequence of a regime they had served. Yet that's exactly the point. The cavalrymen knew this. They weren't naive. They had liberated concentration camps. They had seen the evidence of the Holocaust. They had lost friends to German bullets and bombs. They fed these women not because they were innocent, but because the war was ending. And someone had to begin the work of rebuilding humanity from the ruins. The symbolic weight of that meal, crude as it was, cannot be overstated. Food has always been a language of power. Who eats and who starves is often the most fundamental expression of dominance. The Nazi regime had weaponized hunger systematically, starving millions in occupied territories, using food as a tool of genocide. And here were American soldiers, at the moment of total victory, choosing abundance over revenge. The chocolate bars left the deepest impression. Multiple testimonies mention them specifically. The Hershey's tropical bar, designed to withstand heat, packaged for practicality, mass-produced by the millions, became, in that context, something almost sacramental. Ing's testimony again, the chocolate. I remember the chocolate most of all. It tasted like nothing I remembered. Sweeter than anything we'd had during the war. And the soldier who gave it to me, he was just a boy really. Maybe 20, he smiled when he handed it to me. smiled, as if it brought him joy to feed me. I couldn't understand it. I still don't, entirely. In the weeks and months that followed, the women were dispersed to various POW camps, processed, interrogated, and eventually released as the occupation government decided they posed no security threat. Most returned to a Germany that no longer existed, cities reduced to rubble, families scattered or dead, a nation psychologically shattered. They carried with them memories of what they had witnessed and experienced, including that inexplicable meal in a field outside Pilsen. Marguerite became a schoolteacher in post-war West Germany. She never spoke publicly about her war service, but she kept her diary, and before her death in 1998, she donated it to a historical archive. In the final entry, dated April 30th, 1945, the day after the meal, she wrote, "Today, I learned that the world is larger than the lies they told us, that humanity is more complicated than propaganda, that the enemy is never just the enemy. I don't know what happens next. I don't know if I deserve to survive. But I know that I will never forget the American cowboys who set a table for us when they could have simply let us die. And I know that whatever I do with the rest of my life, I must try to understand what that kindness meant, what it demanded of me." Some of the cavalrymen stayed in touch with each other after the war, bonded by shared experience. They would gather at reunions and tell stories, and this one, the one about the German women and the field dinner, became something of a legend within their community. But they didn't tell it as a tale of heroism. They told it as something stranger, a moment when the war paused, when the machinery of violence stopped grinding long enough for something human to emerge. Captain Hendricks went back to his ranch in Texas, raised cattle, and never spoke much about the war. But his grandson, interviewed for an oral history project in 2001, remembered one thing his grandfather had said near the end of his life: "War makes you capable of terrible things. But it also gives you choices you'd never face otherwise. And the choices you make in those moments, when you're exhausted and angry and you've seen too much death, those define you more than anything else in your life." The historian Anthony Beaver once observed that the final months of World War II in Europe were characterized by a strange duality: immense cruelty existing alongside unexpected moments of humanity. The same armies that committed atrocities also produced acts of startling compassion. The same soldiers who shot prisoners in one village might share rations with starving civilians in the next. Human behavior under extreme stress is not consistent. It is jagged, contradictory, capable of both the worst and the best. The story of the German women and the American cowboys represents one node in that complicated matrix. It doesn't redeem the war. It doesn't erase the crimes of the Reich or absolve those who served it. But it does remind us that even in the darkest chapters of human history, individuals retain the capacity to choose differently, to see the person in the uniform, to recognize suffering even in those who have caused suffering. By mid-May 1945, the war in Europe was over. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The American cavalry units, including the 2nd Cavalry Group, began transitioning to occupation duties. The women who had been fed that night scattered to different camps, different fates. Some emigrated. Some rebuilt lives in Germany. Some never fully recovered from what they had experienced and witnessed during those years, but the memory of that meal persisted. In interviews conducted decades later, 3 of the women were located by researchers. All 3 mentioned it unprompted. All 3 described it as a pivotal moment, not just in terms of physical survival, but psychological reorientation. One of them, Helga, the former schoolteacher, said in a 1979 interview, "That was when I began to believe that perhaps the world wasn't wholly mad. That perhaps there was something beyond the cruelty we had normalized. It didn't make me forgive myself, but it made me think that maybe forgiveness was possible. That maybe rebuilding was possible. The field outside Pilsen is now agricultural land, unmarked and unremarkable. No monument commemorates what happened there. No plaque explains that on April 29, 1945, in the chaotic final days of the Third Reich's collapse, a group of American cavalrymen decided to set a table for their starving enemies. History has a way of erasing these small moments in favor of the grand sweeps, the battles, the treaties, the movements of armies across maps, but perhaps the small moments matter more. Perhaps the real story of how we survived the 20th century, how we emerged from its industrial-scale slaughter with any humanity intact, is hidden in these fragments. A table set in a field. Chocolate bars shared. Coffee poured for people who had every reason to expect. Execution and received instead an invitation to eat. The philosopher Hannah Arendt wrote that the banality of evil is matched by the banality of good ordinary people making ordinary moral choices that, in aggregate, determine the character of civilizations. The cavalrymen who set that table weren't saints. They were ranch hands and farm boys in uniform, doing what seemed right according to values they'd learned long before the war. They didn't debate ethical philosophy. They just saw hungry people and fed them. And the women who ate at that table carried the memory forward into the complicated decades of post-war Germany, through the denazification process, through the economic miracle and the slow reckoning with the Holocaust. That meal didn't absolve them of participation in an evil system, but it gave them a reference point, a moment when the enemy had been more humane than their own regime. A moment that demanded they reconsider everything they'd been taught. In the end, that may be the most radical act of all, to offer kindness when cruelty is expected, to set a table when you could simply walk away, to recognize that the war you're winning is not just against armies and ideologies, but against the impulse toward dehumanization itself. 79 years later, as we sort through the countless testimonies and documents from that war, stories like this one emerge like artifacts from a shipwreck, fragile, incomplete, but somehow essential. They remind us that history is not just made by generals and politicians, but by the thousands of small choices made by ordinary people under extraordinary pressure. The choice to feed or to starve, to brutalize or to show mercy, to see an enemy or to see a human being in need. The documents exist tucked away in archives, preserved in private letters, recorded in fading voices on oral history tapes. The testimonies remain memories of chocolate bars and coffee, of tables set in fields, of cowboys who chose abundance over revenge. The questions still haunt us. What would we have done? What will we do when our moment comes? How do we remain human when the world demands we become monsters? History doesn't repeat, but it echoes. And some echoes demand we listen. Subscribe to uncover more buried truths from the war that shaped our world. The moments of unexpected grace, hidden in the shadow of unspeakable horror. The choices that remind us we are always more than what the worst of us become. D fed them.